How's everybody doing? Welcome back to another episode of The Banker Next Door. I am your host, Dr. Joe Berquist. Tonight, we are continuing the Lords of Easy Money series. This is part 16, and we are finally moving on to the final section of the book, which is part 3. And tonight, we're going to be covering chapter 13. I don't have the typical review that I usually start with because in the last episode, in episode 15, I did a full review of the last 6 chapters, which was part 2 of the book. So I'm not going to cover that here tonight. If you want to see that, go back to episode 15 and you can get kind of the quick 6-chapter review. And like I said, tonight we're going to get into chapter 13. Now, this is the how should I say it? This is the main part of the book that we're coming into here. Basically, this is the climax, if you will. We still have 3 more chapters after this, but this is where the big reveal, so to speak, comes to play, and this is a whopper. And I warn you, because once you hear what's in this chapter, your eyes are going to be open to kind of a new world, and you're never going to be able to go back, hence from whence you came. So sit tight and strap in, because we're going to get rolling. But before I do that, let me bring up our trusty PowerPoint guide here. So just to go over real quick here. So part 3 is called Let Them Eat Assets. And it is chapter 13, which is the invisible bailout. Chapter 14, which is infection, which is, COVID. Chapter 15 is winners and losers. And chapter 16 is called The Long Crash. And that is the last chapter of the book, which is what we end with. And so I'm just going to go in here. Okay, so chapter 13 here, the invisible bailout. And we're going to start with where we left off, which was September 13th, 2019. We get into panic at the New York Federal Reserve Bank. So here we go. So at 9:05 a.m. on the morning of Friday, September 13th, 2019, a group of financial traders and analysts gathered for their regular daily meeting at the New York Federal Reserve Bank. These traders were expected every weekday to have a firm grasp of what was happening in global markets so that they could explain it to their boss, whose name was Lori Logan, who oversaw the New York Fed's entire trading floor. Logan was a petite woman with dark hair, cut in shoulder-length bob. Her features were sharp, and her language had the crisp cadence of an effective bureaucrat. She had an advanced degree in public administration, not economics, but had developed a sharp and finely detailed view of the Fed's financial plumbing system since joining the bank in the late 1990s. On that Friday in September, Logan's mind was on an upcoming trip. She would soon head to Washington for the FOMC's regularly scheduled meeting, which started the following Tuesday. Logan and her team would set up shop at the Eschels building on Monday to finalize their presentations for the committee. Usually, this would occupy most of Logan's attention, but on her last day in New York, the analysts delivered a warning during the morning meeting. They were detecting troubling signs in the market, and they believed things might well get much, much worse on Monday when Logan would be on the road. The conference room in the New York Fed was located just off the main trading floor, and its doors were open during meetings so people could quietly go in and out. The room was anchored by a large table with a couch along the wall for staffers to sit with their laptops open and take notes. There was a set of large digital monitors hanging on one wall, one of which provided a live video feed from an eerily identical room in Chicago, in a Fed satellite office near the important Chicago Mercantile Exchange. So now we're going to get into the global market for U.S. dollars, or what they refer to as money markets. After everyone got settled that morning, the New York traders described what had them worried. They had been watching the enormous global market for U.S. dollars, which they referred to simply as money markets. The money markets tracked the flow of real, actual, hard cash as it circulated around the world. There were many parts of this market, including overnight loans that banks used to keep their books straight, along with the billions of dollars borrowed daily by hedge funds to finance their bets. The New York Fed was obsessed with global money markets. The Fed's primary job was to control the price of money, and this price was expressed in the short-term interest rates paid by the banks and hedge funds. The Fed's traders were worried that there might be a cash squeeze looming on the horizon. It was true that the world was awash in cash, perhaps more cash than existed at any point in history. But the traders were seeing market signals indicating that short-term interest rates were rising, and they might continue to do so, maybe sharply. This got Lori Logan's full attention. Her primary job was to ensure that interest rates did not rise or fall beyond the narrow band dictated by the FOMC. She directed her team to elevate their monitoring of the marketplace, which meant that they would start making calls to financial traders and heighten their surveillance of certain contracts that reflected the short-term price of money. The Fed itself was directly responsible for the situation. The strain on financial markets was happening as a direct result of the normalization process overseen by Jay Powell. Remember what happened last chapter. Normalization had been taken off autopilot and had been essentially halted, but the FOMC had nonetheless withdrawn some of the extraordinary interventions of the Bernanke era. When the Fed reversed quantitative easing, it drained more than $1 trillion of excess cash out of the banking system. Excess bank reserves, to be exact, meaning the level of cash that banks kept in vaults inside the Fed had been drawn down from about 2.7 trillion in 2014 to about 1.3 trillion in September of 2019. This was still about 76,000% more excess bank reserves than existed in 2008. I have to say it again. This is still above 76,000% more excess bank reserves than existed in 2008, but the reduction was significant. The problem, in the view of Logan's team, was that even 1.3 trillion in excess reserves might not be enough to keep the banking system working. So now we're going to get into the repo market melts down. The warning signs, Logan's team explained, were coming from the crucially important cash repo market. The repo market was part of the bedrock of the financial world, and it was supposed to be a super safe form of lending. A repo loan was short term, maybe as short as overnight. It always worked the same way. A borrower would hand over treasury bills in exchange for cash. Then the next day or the next week, the borrower would give back the cash in return for the treasury bills, paying a very tiny fee for the transaction. The whole point of a repo loan was to be able to get cash when you needed it in exchange for ultra-safe treasury bonds. This was very important for Wall Street firms. They had hard assets like treasury bills, which were worth a lot, and they needed ways to unlock that value in the form of cash to meet their overnight obligations. Banks were more than happy to do this short-term loan because it was so safe. The banks held on to the treasury bills as collateral, so there really wasn't any risk. If the borrower went belly up, the bank could sell the treasuries and recoup the total value of the loan. This is why the repo loan market was a multi-billion-dollar market. All kinds of financial institutions used it every day to swap treasuries for cash, so they had money on hand to do daily business. On Friday the 13th, however, the repo market was sending out flashing signals. There were early signs that big banks like JP Morgan were increasing the very tiny interest rates they charged for repo loans. Logan's team believed the banks might raise rates because they were growing hesitant to extend repo loans. The banks seemed to feel that they were running too low on cash reserves. On the following Monday, the banks would be running extra low on cash because two things would happen at the same time. First, it was tax day for big corporations, which meant that banks would be sending a lot of cash out the door to pay tax bills. Second, this happened to be the day when a lot of auctions for U.S. Treasury bills were going to settle, meaning that banks had to pay cash for Treasury bills they had earlier agreed to buy. All of this would drain cash from the system and reduce the level of excess reserves. Logan was persuaded that this might be a problem. If the banks started balking at offering repo loans on Monday, they might charge more money for the loans, pushing repo rates from their current level of about 1.5% to elevated levels of 1.8% or even 2%. This would in turn spill out into all corners of the money markets, elevating rates for money everywhere. This is why Logan instructed her staff to heighten their monitoring of repo markets. Logan left work that day focused on her trip to Washington and the upcoming FOMC meeting. Her staff in New York focused all their attention on repo loans. The events of the following Monday showed that the Fed's new New York trading team was essentially flying blind in the age of ZIRP. This meant that the entire leadership team of the Fed, including Jay Powell, was also flying blind. The central bank had transformed the financial landscape by swapping it with money, and in doing so had destroyed one monetary regime and replaced it with a new one. But there was no reliable instrument to measure the terrain of the new regime. This fact was made a stark reality on Monday when the repo market blew up. The resulting market crisis almost became a full-fledged financial crisis. At a moment in history when the markets were supposed to be stable and in good health, The only reason that this didn't happen was that the Fed stepped in almost instantaneously and initiated a $400 billion bailout. This bailout was unprecedented, and it benefited a small group of hedge funds. Benefited a small group of hedge funds that had essentially hijacked the repo market and used it as a vehicle to make risky bets. The Fed saved them from the consequences of those bets. But maybe the most remarkable part of the bailout is the Fed did it without much notice. A $400 billion emergency cash injection was no longer news. The Fed described it as a matter of normal maintenance. But that's not how it looked from inside the Fed as the repo market melted down. Wow. That last two paragraphs there just, hits you like a ton of bricks. So they were flying blind in the age of ZERP. They had transformed the financial landscape by swapping it with money, and in doing so had destroyed one monetary regime and replaced it with a new one. Then they came in and they bailed out with $400 billion. They bailed out a bunch of hedge funds. And then they did it in such a quiet fashion that basically hardly anybody knew what was going on. The mainstream press certainly didn't pay any attention to it. And it's just like, wow. And these hedge funds had hijacked, this is the author's words, they had hijacked the repo market. And we're going to see how they did it in just a few minutes. So now we're going to go, repo rates continue to spike. On Monday morning, September 16th, Logan and her team arrived at the Eschels building. As always, they arranged a temporary office in a large conference room on the third floor of the building. They gathered around a table and started to prepare for the series of complex presentations they would give the next day to the FOMC members. This preparation was laborious and could take a long time, but Logan's team barely had time to begin. The chaos erupted before the markets even opened. The third floor conference room soon turned into a war room and frantic communications hub. The trading analysts in New York reported that repo rates were spiking. It wasn't unusual for repo rates to rise about 0.3% in times of stress. Now, a little sidebar here. So rates in this passage refer to the so-called SOFR, repo rate used by the Fed, a commonly cited rate in the market. So the SOFR is the single overnight financing rate. SOFR, single overnight financing rate. In December of 2018, for example, the repo rate spiked dangerously during the market turmoil that prompted Jay Powell to reverse the normalization process. At that time, the rates had jumped alarmingly high from about 2.5% to over 3%. Nobody was expecting that much movement in September when markets were tranquil, unemployment was low, and the economy was growing. The New York desk sent an alarming dispatch to Logan's team on Monday morning. Repo rates continued spiking. They would hit 5% that day. Nobody knew what was going on. This was the kind of repo rate that signaled a market panic, but there was no discernible reason for a panic. No bank had gone bust. No nation had just defaulted on its debt, and no major news had come out of a central bank. The analysts in New York were trying to get a handle on why the rates were spiking. Two of Logan's top deputies, Patricia Zobel and Nate Werfel, were with her in the conference room in Washington, and they quickly started work on a plan to quell markets if the rates didn't fall. One option seemed obvious. The Fed could start trading in the repo markets itself, offering cheap repo loans in the same way it offered emergency loans to a failing bank. This would be a radical step. The Fed hadn't done repo trades, at least on a significant level, in nearly a decade. It quickly became clear that the turmoil was not a fluke. The market was, in fact, deteriorating. Logan quickly elevated the crisis to her boss, John Williams, the newly appointed president of the New York Fed. Williams was an economist who was previously the president of the San Francisco Fed. His background was in economic research, not market operations. He came across as a congenial professor with a big smile and a large round eyeglasses. He had taken over the New York Fed shortly after Jay Powell became Fed chairman, and the two men had developed a close working relationship. On that Monday morning, Williams was down on the second floor of the Eschels building in an office that was permanently reserved for the New York Fed president. He, too, was preparing for Tuesday's FOMC meeting. The world was expecting another rate cut from the Fed following the cut in July. This was controversial because it was so unusual to cut rates when the economy was growing and there was a lot riding on the meeting. But Williams' work was interrupted. On Monday afternoon, Lori Logan dispatched a message to Williams, Jay Powell, and Vice Chairman Richard Clarida. The repo market was seizing up, she reported. It wasn't stopping, and her team was simultaneously trying to understand the problem and come up with a plan to deal with it. If the repo rates did not immediately subside from 5% back into a normal range between, say, 2.25 and 2.5%, they could precipitate a cascading series of failures on Wall Street. All those hedge funds that used repo loans to pay their daily bills would be forced to find other ways to raise cash and raise it quickly. This meant they would start selling off hard assets like treasury bills or mortgage-backed securities. When too many people do this at once, it creates a deleveraging event, meaning that everyone is liquidating their holdings at the same time, which causes prices to crash. The deleveraging event might even be, in the words of Jay Powell, large and dynamic. But this risk, as bad as it was only part of the problem. Williams and Logan worried about something even more fundamental. If the repo rates didn't fall, this would put pressure on other short-term rates, including the all-important federal funds rate that measured overnight loans. If the Fed funds rate rose beyond the FOMC's target, the world's most powerful central bank would have effectively lost control of the price of money. The painful irony was that the Fed had used the repo market for many decades as its primary way to control short-term rates. The Fed traders in New York had a finely tuned system by which they injected or withdrew cash from the banking system almost daily by buying and selling repo contracts. These were the very open market operations referred to in the FOMC's name, the Federal Open Market Committee. The trades went out into the open market. The traders went out into the open markets to buy and sell repo loans as a way to manage the money supply. Now we've gotten into how the Fed historically utilizes the repo market. This system was destroyed when Ben Bernanke's Fed decided to embark on years of quantitative easing and 0% interest rates. A side effect of QE was that the Fed swapped the delicate ecosystem of open market operations with so much cash. The Fed's own repo traders had bought and sold repos with precision, like a piano tuner who tightened or loosened strings to keep them at the precisely correct level of tension. The traders would buy only $6 billion or so of repo loans or sell the same amount in very targeted transactions that kept the money supply exactly where the Fed wanted it. Buying repo loans injected a little more cash while selling them removed a little cash. The important thing about all this cash was that it existed inside the reserve accounts of the big banks. Each reserve account was like a glass of water, filled right to the red line that represented the minimum level of required reserves. Banks didn't want to have any reserves above the level of that red line because they could be lending that money out for a profit, but they also didn't want the money to be below the red line because then they'd be violating the rules on keeping a minimum amount of reserves. This need to keep reserves right on the red line explains why there was a big market in overnight loans between banks. After the day's hectic activity, banks that ended up with too much money lent it out to banks that happened to have too little money. The Fed traders used their repo trades to gently fill more glasses with more water, reducing demand for overnight loans and therefore lowering interest rates. And they used reverse repo trades to gently remove money from the glasses, increasing demand for loans and causing rates to rise. This worked well in the long era of scarce bank reserves. Quantitative easing didn't just overfill the glasses with excess reserves, it flooded the room in which the glasses were held. Then it replaced the glasses with silos so that they could hold the trillions of dollars in new liquid reserves. This meant that doing little repo trades worth $6 billion was totally meaningless. It had no effect on the demand for overnight loans. The Fed realized very early on that its open market operations would be an early casualty of the bailouts that happened in late 2007 as the mortgage market collapsed. William Dudley, who was the New York Fed president, warned about this during an emergency FOMC conference call on December 6, 2007. We cannot change the amount of reserves in the system if we want to keep the federal funds rate anchored at the target. So they knew this was going to be a side effect here. And now we're going to move down here. So the Fed's new powers that were granted to them in October of 2008. So rather than hold back its bailouts, the Fed invented a new way to control short-term interest rates. Congress helped solve this problem by giving the Fed new powers that were buried in the Emergency Bailout Act of October 2008, which authorized the $700 billion bailout known as the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP. What went unnoticed was that the law also updated the Federal Reserve Act in a manner that paved the way for quantitative easing. Surprise, surprise. It allowed the Fed for the first time to directly pay banks an interest rate on the cash they held in their Federal Reserve accounts. Okay, so now we got a little sidebar here. The Fed was originally granted this authority back in 2006, but the original law didn't make the move effective until 2011. The 2008 law just moved up the date so the Fed could have more freedom to fight the financial crisis. Okay, fair enough. This might seem trivial, but it's what allowed the Fed to transform the financial system. Now the Fed didn't need repo operations to control short-term rates. There was no ceiling anymore on the level of excess bank reserves. Instead of controlling rates through repo trades, the Fed would control them by lifting or lowering the interest on excess reserves, or IOER rate. The interest on excess reserves, the IOER rate. None of this mattered for many years because interest rates were at zero. Demand for overnight loans was basically zero because there were so many dollars in the system. The real test of how well the system worked would only come if the Fed tried to raise rates. Oh, here we go. So everything was fine at zero, but the minute they tried to increase rates, this whole new monetary system that they put in place basically fell apart. That's what you have to understand. When the Fed finally hiked rates at the end of 2015, it did so by raising the IOER rate. The whole thing was an experiment conducted in real time, and it carried real risks. Let me say that again. The whole thing was an experiment conducted in real time, and it carried big risks. Simon Potter, who ran the New York Fed trading desk before Lori Logan, co-wrote an academic study in early 2020 evaluating these risks. Potter tried to figure out what might happen if the Fed actually got serious about normalization and withdrew the excess bank reserves. At some point, the reserves would hit a level where they were actually scarce again. At that moment, the interest rate banks charged for an overnight loan would probably not creep up in a steady and predictable way. It would likely jolt up as banks realized for the first time in a decade that reserves were scarce. Everything would be calm until it wasn't, and then interest rates would spike. The problem was that nobody knew exactly when this moment would hit and how low was too low. That was the big question. The Fed seemed, however, to get this answer. The number where reserves turned out to be scarce was 1.39 trillion, which was the level hit on Monday morning. Okay, now we're going to get into the repo market will not abate. What do we do? Logan and her team worked until after 7 in the evening on Monday to get an accurate picture of the repo markets. Around 8 that night, Logan met with Williams in the lobby of the hotel in D.C. where the Fed official stayed. She told him the situation was very bad. The repo panic was not abating. But even more worrisome, it looked like the Fed funds rate was about to rise above the level set by the FOMC. Williams was persuaded that something needed to be done. The situation seemed like a mini panic, a breakdown in the market that wasn't going to heal itself quickly. Williams believed that the traders on Wall Street were deeply uncertain about what was going on, and the Fed needed to act fast to restore their confidence. On Tuesday morning, Williams and Logan arrived early at the Eschels building to hold an emergency meeting with Powell and Clarida. Logan presented the plan that her team had developed. If market conditions worsened, as the data seemed to predict, the Fed would be ready to act. That morning, the price of repo loans crossed 9.5%. Talk about a spike, 9.5%. This was the territory that caused financial meltdowns. That day, the Fed initiated an unprecedented intervention into repo markets, offering to pump $75 billion into the overnight markets. That was just the start of a long bailout, which would later come to include massive new rounds of quantitative easing. When the Fed announced these measures, it used a lot of technical terms and talked about the whole thing as if it were a plumbing job. But this obscured an important reality. The money that the Fed unleashed was not a neutral force. It benefited some people and disadvantaged others. Oh, here we go. This is getting good. It's getting real good. Okay, now we're going to get into hedge funds take over the repo market. Yes. So when the repo market rose above 9%, it seemed like a scary but abstract number. This number, in fact, told a story. The number reflected a struggle that was going on between real people. On one side of the struggle were lenders like JP Morgan who offered repo loans. On the other side of the struggle was someone who desperately needed a repo loan to stay in business. The intensity of this struggle was made clear as the repo rate number went higher and higher. When the rate hit 9%, it meant that somebody out there was so terrified and desperate that they were willing to pay loan shark rates of 8% to secure a totally collateralized overnight loan, which normally cost about 2% or less. But even more amazing than this, the person on the other side of the struggle was not willing to extend a super safe overnight repo loan at the price of 8%. The lender wanted 9%. This indicated that the lenders were very nervous about the people who wanted to borrow repo loans. The scarcity of bank reserves revealed this nervousness, but did not create it. During the age of ZIRP, the repo market had transformed. Before the financial crisis, the market was mostly used by banks, but the banks didn't use repo loans as often now that they had, because they had so much cash. A new group of financial players stepped in and started using repos, hedge funds. The amount of overnight repo loans used by non-bank actors like hedge funds roughly doubled between 2008 and 2019, rising from about 1 trillion to 2 trillion. This figure, 2 trillion, understated just how important the repo market had become to hedge funds. Hedge funds used repo loans as the cornerstone to build a much larger structure of debt. They got cash from a repo loan, then used that cash as the payment to make a larger bet in the marketplace. Wall Street called this technique leveraging up, meaning you borrowed $1 to pay for a $10 wager. The hedge funds used 2 trillion in overnight repo loans to build positions in the market that were much, much larger than the repo loans themselves. Even the Federal Reserve was not entirely aware of what was going on. It was obvious that hedge funds were doing a lot more repo loans than they used to, but it wasn't clear why. What were they funding? And how risky were their activities? This remained a mystery because the hedge funds weren't regulated as tightly as banks. They were part of a shadow banking system that didn't face as much scrutiny from the FDIC and all the Dodd-Frank rules. The theory behind this was that hedge funds were sophisticated investors who could succeed or fail on their own merits. Even months after the repo market collapsed in 2019, the Treasury Department wasn't entirely sure what the hedge funds had been up to. But like forensic analysts digging through the debris of an explosion, they discovered some convincing clues. So, I mean, there's so much to unpack there. It's just unbelievable. You think back to earlier chapters when Jeremy Powell was working at the Treasury and he had uncovered the Salmon brothers basically trying to take over the Treasuries market and all the corruption there. And you would have thought that they would have learned from that lesson and that that the regulators would be watching what was going on. And here we find out that they're totally asleep at the wheel. They're totally asleep at the wheel. And even worse, they allowed hedge funds to come in, totally take over, totally manipulate the repo market, and then basically use the repo market as their personal casino to just ramp up all these ridiculous bets and basically almost crash the economy when all their bets went bad. And as far as hedge funds being these uber sophisticated people, I got one name for you: long-term capital management. And if you've never heard of long-term management, Google it and go look it up, because that's the kind of disaster that hedge funds can bring you when you let them do crap like this. All right, so now we're going to talk about what they call the basis risk trade. This is fun. I'm telling you, this just keeps getting better and better. The hedge funds had been piling into a very particular trade called the basis risk trade. The tactic was made possible by the very market tranquility that the Fed had manufactured over the years of quantitative easing and ZIRP. The basis trade worked well only in an environment of enforced tranquility, where traders knew that the Fed would step in and stop any violent market turmoil. When this condition was met, hedge funds felt justified in borrowing hundreds of billions of dollars to build a trade that was virtually risk-free as long as market volatility was dead. The design was simple. A hedge fund trader searched out a small wrinkle in financial markets that almost always occurred naturally. The wrinkle was the very minute difference in the very minute difference in the price between a treasury bill and a futures contract on that treasury bill. Okay, now another sidebar here. So we got a futures contract is basically a promise to deliver a treasury bill to someone on a certain date in the future at a certain price. The contracts are often dated in months, with a 3-month futures contract promising delivery 3 months in the future. There are lots of good reasons to do something like this beyond mere speculation. Lots of futures contracts are used as insurance policies against future events. A short position is a bet that the price of something will fall. For those that don't know that. This difference in price between the treasury bill you buy today and the price of a treasury futures contract is called the basis. The hedge fund exploits the very tiny basis by purchasing a lot of the treasury bills along with the futures contracts on the bills. The hedge fund then just holds on to the bills and delivers them on the date they're due, collecting a profit that is the basis price difference. This is where the repo market comes in. The profit margin on a basis trade was essentially guaranteed, but it's small. To make the trade pay off, a hedge fund needs to make the trade thousands of times over. They use the repo market to pull this off. The hedge fund takes the treasury bill, uses it as collateral, and gets the cash needed to load up on treasury futures contracts. The hedge funds were able to lever up their bets by a factor of 50 to 1, meaning every dollar they had allowed them to borrow 50 more dollars to use for trading. Ultimately, the hedge funds built a mutually reinforced tripod of debt and risk between treasury bills, repo loans, and treasury futures. It was easy money, like collecting millions of loose pennies off the sidewalk. The hedge funds didn't have to report how much money they had put into a trade like this, but a subsequent Treasury Department investigation provided a good estimate. Between 2014 and 2019, the total value of short positions in the Treasury futures markets owned by hedge funds rose from about 200 billion to nearly 900 billion. This position was key to making the basis trade work. The market for basis trades appeared to have been dominated by a group of hedge funds called relative value funds. These included relatively obscure firms like LMR Partners and Bluecrest Capital Management. The basis trade worked just fine as long as repo prices stayed low and stable. If the price of repo loans rose, it instantly demolished the profitability of the basis trade. The hedge funds found themselves obligated to make payments on their futures contracts, but had to pay more money to keep the repo debt rolling. When repo rates spiked in mid-September, financial analysts on Wall Street started hearing alarming stories. Yeah, like, oh crap, Johnny's about to throw himself out the window kind of stories. Certain hedge funds were very, very desperate to raise cash and raise it quickly. I bet they were. Ralph Axel, an analyst with Bank of America, captured the moment in a report published months later. His message was chilling. He pointed out that the hedge fund's dependence on repo loans had doubled in a decade. If the repo market was closed off to hedge funds, then they would be forced to liquidate treasury bills and mortgage securities at a level that was twice as large as the amount liquidated in 2008. Let me say that again. If the repo market was closed off to hedge funds, then they would be forced to liquidate treasury bills and mortgage securities at a level that was twice as large as the amount liquidated in 2008. Always understated, Axel wrote, the impact could be massive. The financial world faced a forced liquidation event that could be twice as large as that in the horrific crash of 2008. And this was all happening during the apparently sunny weather of an economic boom when markets were not just stable, but rising. Okay, now we're going to get into the Fed bails out the hedge funds. Surprise, surprise. When the Fed entered the repo market on September 17th, it bailed out any hedge fund that found themselves desperate for a repo loan. The going rate for such a loan was over 9% that day. The Fed offered such loans at 2.1%, using money it could create instantaneously. The hedge funds could breathe. Oh, thank goodness. Thank goodness the hedge funds were safe. The repo market was once again available to them. It is difficult to quantify financially just how much money this was worth to the hedge funds. They saved a great deal of money on the repo loan itself, but they also saved a nearly incalculable amount by escaping the consequences of having entered basis risk trades that went bad. The Fed made sure that hedge funds did not need to liquidate their holdings. The Fed had offered $75 billion in overnight repo loans the first day. The pace picked up over the following weeks. The program became open-ended and continued through the autumn, growing in size. By October 23rd, the Fed said that the minimum size of its overnight repos would be $120 billion. The central bank was offering a mix of overnight and long-term repo loans. On October 29th, it would boost its long-term repos from $35 billion to $45 billion a day alongside the short-term overnight loans. It appears that some hedge funds took the chance to unwind at least some of their basis trades while they had the chance. The volume of short positions on Treasury futures fell gradually through the fall and into early 2020, dropping from nearly $900 billion to less than $800 billion, but it was still roughly quadruple what it had been in 2014. So now we're going to talk about the Fed covers up its actions. When the Fed announced its repo intervention, it didn't talk about hedge funds or basis trades or the fact that it was improvising a new system for controlling the overnight loan rates. As the repo bailout continued over weeks and months, Fed officials like Powell, Logan, and Williams talked about it as if it were a routine form of system maintenance. The Fed focused narrowly on how the repo meltdown affected the Fed funds rate. When the rate broke past its prescribed boundaries, it triggered something called the standing directive at the New York Fed. The standing directive was the order to keep short-term interest rates where the FOMC wanted them to be. That day in September, the target rate was between 2 and 2.25%, which was breached. So the New York Fed initiated the repo intervention to get the rate back in line. The whole thing was reminiscent of a joke that circulated in Silicon Valley. The joke described a new artificial intelligence machine that was given unlimited power to fulfill a simple directive. Reduce the amount of spam email. The AI program analyzed the problem, realized that all spam emails were created by humans, and so launched a wave of nuclear warheads to wipe out humanity. No more spam, a simple directive fulfilled by sweeping powers. Now, that's kind of, given where we are today, that joke is not quite as funny. Considering that, Chat GPT might do that to us someday. However, I digress. The repo bailout succeeded and fulfilled the directive. The Fed funds rate was pushed back into range, but the overnight repo loans were just the start of the operation. As the repo loans expanded during the following weeks, Powell was already discussing the next phase of the plan. The Fed was going to get back into the business of quantitative easing. Did they ever really get out? During normalization, the Fed had drawn down bank reserves to $1.39 trillion and discovered the bottom of the swimming pool. Even if the Fed offered cheap repo loans on a permanent basis, which it was considering, it needed to deal with the structural problem of scarce bank reserves. So now we're going to get into what they called non-QE. On October 4th, 2 weeks after the repo crisis, the FOMC held an emergency video conference call. The meeting began with a presentation from the Fed staff, which showed that the Fed intervention had worked, but the real problem hadn't gone away. Tax time rolled around quarterly, and banks might once again find themselves in a cash pinch. It was unclear what the markets might look like when that happened. To combat this uncertainty, the Fed needed to pump money back into the system. The most obvious way to do this was another round of quantitative easing. Every member of the FOMC agreed with the idea according to minutes of the call. As the Fed finalized its plans, Powell traveled to Denver to speak at an economics conference. He took the chance during his speech to announce what the Fed was about to do. At some point, we will begin increasing our securities holdings to maintain an appropriate level of reserves. That time is now upon us, Powell said. I want to emphasize that growth of our balance sheet for reserve management purposes should in no way be confused with the large-scale asset purchase programs that we deployed after the financial crisis. Don't confuse the two. Powell was saying that the Fed was going to do something that appeared to be quantitative easing, but was not, in fact, quantitative easing. The key difference seemed to be the Fed's intent. The Fed was pumping money into bank reserve accounts to stimulate the economy this time. It was just doing it to keep reserve levels high for maintenance. About a week later, the Fed announced it would buy about $60 billion worth of Treasury bills per month. Between September 2019 and February 2020, the Fed created about 413 billion new dollars in the banking system, judging by the increase of its balance sheet. This was one of the largest financial interventions of any kind in many years. The traders on Wall Street nicknamed the new program NQE, short for non-QE, but they had no illusions about what was happening. The Fed put was being, remember last couple chapters we talked about the Bernanke put, the Powell put, the Yellen put. Well, this is it became the basic policy at the Fed became the Fed put. So the Fed put was being expanded and enmeshed more deeply into markets. The deployment of overnight repo loans showed that the Fed would not tolerate dangerous flare-ups in the market. The hedge funds acted on this insight, borrowing more money and using it to buy shares of stock. A Goldman Sachs index showed that debt-fueled hedge fund trades rose sharply after the repo bailout and the dawn of non-QE. In February 2020 alone, the leverage ratio of hedge funds, meaning their debt compared to assets, rose by 5%, the biggest increase in years. On January 13th, 2020, the Dow Jones Industrial Average broke above 29,000 points, marking a record high. So now we're going to get, as we come to the end here, we're going to catch up here with Tom Honig, our hero of the book, as we catch up here after this just one incredible action from the Fed after the next. So by early 2020, Thomas Honig had migrated away from the center of American economic power and decision-making. There wasn't exactly a booming market for Tom's political philosophy about the banking system or market structures. After he left the FDIC, Tom started spending a lot more time around his house in Kansas City. He wrote a series of academic lectures on the financial system and wrote periodic opinion pieces about banking and monetary policy. He got a job as a senior fellow at the Mercatus Center, a libertarian-leaning think tank based at George Mason University in suburban Washington, D.C. Tom's perch at Mercatus reflected the fractured public discussion about the Federal Reserve. Most people who criticized the Fed still tended to be conservative. Many of the bank's prominent defenders and former officials migrated to the liberal-leaning think tank, the Brookings Institute, which gave fellowships to Ben Bernanke, Janet Yellen, and other former Fed employees. Bernanke joked that his hallway at Brookings housed the new FOMC, meaning the former Open Market Committee. Brookings hosted events in downtown D.C. featuring Jay Powell and other luminaries. Tom's views, by contrast, rarely seemed to capture headlines. So on Monday, March 2nd, Tom traveled a few minutes from his house to a local shopping district known as Brookside, a row of quaint one-story retail outlets along the moderately busy thoroughfare of 63rd Street. There was a dime store, an ice cream shop, and a drugstore that the locals still called McDaniel's, even though it had been bought out by the CVS chain many years prior. Tom went to a Starbucks that was a relatively recent addition to the neighborhood. He grabbed a table near a window and took off his coat. He was there to meet with a journalist who was reporting on the Fed's repo intervention. Maybe Tom was in a hurry that day, maybe he was overly busy, or maybe something personal was stressing him out. But Tom didn't seem like his usual placid self. He seemed irritable. His irritation became evident as he started talking about the repo bailout. The galling thing about it wasn't just its size or scope or what it said about the fragility of modern financial markets. It was also the fact that nobody seemed to know it had happened. The extraordinary had become routine. The distorted had become ordinary. The massive bailout had become the tool of daily maintenance. And then we get to the end here. They're trapped. They're trapped. Tom screamed it out. They're trapped. He said about the Fed. What he meant was that the Fed was trapped by its own past actions. It was committed to a level of intervention and money creation that would have once seemed wildly improbable. This was what it took to keep basic markets functioning. Tom had been portrayed during 2010 as an inflexible person, even an unsophisticated person, when he voted against quantitative easing and 0% rates. One of his chief warnings was that quantitative easing would be very difficult to undo once it started. Almost a decade later, the difficulty was apparent. This state of affairs was obscured by the very distortions it created. In early 2020, the economy looked fine from the outside. thanks to the dazzling effects of cheap debt, rising asset prices, and a reach for yield that propped up risky investments like corporate junk bonds. It was true that the unemployment rate was at the lowest level in decades at an astoundingly small 3.5%, but the job boom was just only starting to nudge higher after many years of stagnating. The real prosperity was being enjoyed at the highest peaks of the economic system by the people who owned most of the assets. When hedge funds borrowed money and plowed it into the stock market, the daily reports on cable news seemed quite cheerful. The Dow closed at a record high today. Who could complain? In retrospect, Tom's trip to Starbucks seemed like an especially poignant moment. He didn't know it at the time, but this was the closing chapter on an epoch of American economic history. The daily headlines were about a growing viral epidemic. A novel coronavirus was quickly spreading around the world. 158 cases of coronavirus infections had been reported in the United States on March 4th. This was scary, but the guests at Starbucks, where Tom entered and left freely, nobody wore face masks. It was still taken for granted that nobody shook hands when they met. Things seemed normal. Nobody seemed aware of the fact that this was as good as things were going to be for a long, long time. Yeah, I think that was a very poignant way to end this. You know, he didn't know it at the time, but this was the closing chapter on an epoch of American economic history. In certain respects, I think it was the closing chapter. But I think obviously, as we're living it today, it has continued right along. But that basically brings us to the end of our chapter here, and I'm going to close this out. And so this. Wow. I mean, this chapter is just incredible. So here it is. This was the crescendo, if you will. Like this was the big climax of the book right here. You saw the Fed destroyed an economic system and created a new one. And you begin to see how the distortions that they created with quantitative easing, with ZERP, with pumping as much money as they did for so long, they had completely made the repo market irrelevant. And as they said at the end of the chapter there, the totally abnormal became normal. Massive bailouts didn't raise any headlines. They were just a normal they were just a normal everyday thing. The hedge funds, in effect, because the repo market was made irrelevant necessarily for banks and for the Fed in terms of controlling interest rates, that was fine. They allowed the hedge funds to just come in and take over and manipulate the repo market to the point where once rates started to rise, the whole thing unraveled, and literally the repo market almost went down, and in doing so almost took the entire economy with it. And the Fed was able to obscure what was happening so that nobody knew and nobody understood. A lot of people, I remember exactly at that moment, a lot of people, I myself was looking at the repo market going, what in the world is going on here? And the Fed's pumping all this money into the repo market. And I'm going, and my analysis at the time was that the normalization, I felt exactly as Tom Honig did, that it was going to be insanely difficult for the Fed to unwind quantitative easing, that there was no way. They had basically turned the Wall Street into like a market junkie hooked on drugs, and they had to get their shot. They had to get their fix of QE. And the minute you took that away from them, this whole thing was going to come crashing down. And you saw it. Like they tried to normalize, they tried to start raising rates, they tried to reduce their balance sheet, and in doing so, they almost crashed this entire new system that they had set up. And they knew, they were warned back in 2006 by Tom, by the other gentlemen at the Fed. People spoke up, and that's the thing that kills me. People spoke up. People warned about the risks of doing this, taking this extreme, unprecedented actions by conducting what effectively was an experiment on the entire financial system. But they went ahead and did this anyway. And not only did they do it, they did it to just, such an extreme, an unbelievable extreme. So anyway, so that's the end of chapter 13. Next episode, we're going to go into chapter 14. But I really hope that if you're listening to this, that you take some time to reflect on this chapter, because this chapter is so so important. I would even recommend, I hope you listen to this 2 or 3 times, because that's, if again, if you're not really familiar with all the inner workings of Wall Street, with the Fed, New York Fed trading desk and the repo market and the Wall Street traders, I mean, if you don't really understand that world, listen to this a couple of times until it finally starts to click, until it finally starts to set in. And if you are familiar with this world, but you didn't fully understand this, as I did not fully understand this until I had read this book as to exactly what the hedge funds were doing. I mean, it's incredibly eye-opening, and you have to look at it, you have to examine it, you've got to give this a lot of deep thought, because it's a charade. And once you understand the charade, that's why I said at the beginning of this episode, you're about to go through the looking glass. And once you're through the looking glass, can't ever go back. You can't ever go back. Once the mask of the Fed has been ripped off, and you see that all those fancy PhDs and all these supposed to be all these Ivy League educated fancy people completely screwed the pooch and have completely messed up our economy, you can't unsee that. You can't unsee that. And once their imperfections have been shown, there's no going back. There's no going back. There's just, where's the accountability? Where is the accountability? And I believe me, and I'm going to save that whole tirade for the end there. But for when we get to the end, after, so like I said, my plan here is to do the last couple episodes here and then do a wrap-up episode. And so when we get to I'll save my full rant for the wrap-up episode. So, but if you like this episode, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. If you're loving this series, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. It would really help the series. It would really help the channel. And if you are liking this, please go check out some of the other content on the Banker Next Door channel, because I got a lot of great stuff up there. And please make sure to check the weekly banking update. But like I said, I will be back with the next chapter again real soon. And thank you so much for watching. See ya.